thank you everyone for being here on this pretty unusual rainy day in SoCal and Thursday. So, so my topic for today will be Invulnerability, Spear Society, and their encounter with the CCP. So it's a little bit different from the title you see on the program, but it's basically the same content. So I think many of you are probably familiar with this kind of picture produced during the Boxer uprising, right? A lot of missionaries that were reported to this kind of picture of the Boxer practicing the invulnerability rituals on the street, mostly in Beijing. And just to define some of the key terms, the invulnerability rituals I talk about in my essay and also in this presentation, defined as the ability to withstand sharp weapons and even modern weapons. And the most famous one included what you see in Boxer uprising and many Chinese martial arts movies, I think in Jiao's work, like the Jiao and the Tiefushan, and best known to the West during Boxer uprising. And many people may have the wrong conception that, after the Boxer uprising, because the Boxer was cracked down and there was no continuous existence of that ritual, but that's totally untrue. And the ritual continued exist until the early 1950s when the CCP launched very large scale anti-huidaomen campaigns in the 50s. And another key term, Shanghai, in this case, Spear Societies, is defined as the martial arts organization at local level who practice this invulnerability ritual, including the most famous one, like the Dao Hui and Shanghai, and many others you'll see here as well. So this project is based on a larger project, which was actually my dissertation on the huidaomen, which I actually translated into radical religions. Whereas I know other people that still may have different translations, but I want to emphasize the point that they were labeled as radical to the state because they were not the state-sanctioned religions, and it was a generic label used by the CCP since the 1940s. I'm not going to talk too much about the terminology here, but just wanted to give you some sense of the very widespread phenomena of this kind of local groups, not only the Spear Society, but many new religious organizations in the 20th century before the Communist Party came into power. So my paper actually started with the story from the famous Monkey King in Journey to the West. And for many of you who are familiar with the story, in the beginning, the Monkey King upset the big banquet on heaven, and the Communist soldiers were trying to catch him and slice him, with their weapon. They were not able to do that. Even the founder, the claimed founder of Taoism, the Asian Days, trying to, put him in his, all kind of magical objects and try to kill him, but it didn't really work out. So people call him like a piece of diamond that, they cannot really harm through any physical and also magical powers. So I wanted to highlight the point of the piece of diamond because according to some very limited scholarship on the origin of these rituals, Mayor Shahar, who worked on Chinese martial arts, claimed that it came from tantric Buddhism in India, whereas many other people believe it has a Taoist origin from the pursuit of longevity, immortality. I definitely can see some similarity between invulnerability and immortality related to the circulation of qi, internal flow of energy. And in popular culture, it's also very widespread. So if you are familiar with like the Baoshan Taoists or even active today in the martial spirit procession in Taoism, where the Taoists practice all kinds of exorcism that try to drive the demons out of the body of the people, and in many cases it involves a kind of theatrical demonstration of the practitioner being sliced by swords and shed by hot oil as a way to show that I am physically invulnerable to the demons. I can defend the people who are being possessed. And also another phenomenon that's very common in the Boxer uprising, you can find that through actual books on Boxer, the wandering martial arts artists in marketplaces. And I think in China in the 80s, 90s, you can still see this kind of practices in the countryside, where people claim to be invulnerable and they just other people to slice them by using swords or other weapon, and they cannot be harmed. And in the traditional Chinese martial arts, the invulnerability rituals were often seen as something heterodox, vulgar, and superstitious. Right, and when we talk about martial arts in the 20th century, we think about the Jingwu Association, the Wushu movement in the 1930s. But people won't talk about the invulnerability ritual, right? Because it belongs to the uneducated, the grassroots, the rural area, but not really the elite level martial art practices. So if you look at the spells of the boxer uprising, you'll see a lot of charms, talisman related to invulnerability ritual, because the boxer claim themselves to be invulnerable to modern weapons. So the Western army cannot really harm them at all. So the next two quotes actually came from Paul Cohen's book on the history in 3 keys, and just wanted to remind you of some of the Chinese revolutionaries' comments on the boxers, especially the invulnerability rituals. In the case of Zheng Yansan, he was actually similar to the CCP, actually praised the boxer for being revolutionary, for being anti-imperialist, but they criticized the superstition part of the boxer uprising. That's the invulnerability rituals, because it didn't really work out, right? They were not really invulnerable physically. But during the New Cultural Movement and the May 4th generation of intellectuals, they had a totally different view of the boxers. They were, backward, superstitious, and really show the weaknesses of Chinese people. So we need to modernize the society and adopt modern science, something we see in Louis and the Rebecca case as well. And in the case of the Chinese martial arts, then they also adopted many of the teachings of the May 4th and New Cultural Movement generation, such as social Darwinism, nationalism, national salvation. So many of the new martial arts schools were trying to include that kind of national sentiment into their teachings and try to modernize the Chinese martial arts to nurture the physical body of the Chinese people, so they can save their country and compete with the West in the international arena. So martial art must be transformed, modernized, deprived of its superstitious elements, whereas the traditional martial arts usually involve many religious rituals, right? Bringing different gods and different talismans. So invulnerability ritual will definitely the part that must be removed from the Chinese martial arts tradition. So what we see in the case of Chinese martial arts in the Republican period, you see the Jingwu Association in Shanghai, the national martial arts movement launched by the nationalist army in the 1930s, all aim to create a universal scientific martial arts aiming at national salvation. So the superstitious martial art, like the ritual, will further marginalized in the eyes of the elites. But I think in the rural area, it's a totally different picture. People were not really aware of the Jingwu or the national art movement. But I think the CCP had a totally different view regarding the Spear Society and the ritual, especially during the early CCP's expansion. So the CCP saw the Spear Society as a very promising revolutionary force that the CCP had absorbed rural population into their movement as well. As we know, the early CCP in the beginning was largely an urban intellectual movement. So Jiao, for example, the founder of CCP, claimed in one article in 26 that this phenomenon, which referred to the flourishing of the Spear Society, of course, northern rural China, has proven that the peasants in China are awakening, knowing that they can only rely on self-alliance to liberate themselves from the disturbances of imperialism, warlordism, and banditry. So they have the potential to be a great revolutionary force in the future. And these two quotes from the CCP's meetings from 1922, the 26 and 28. And in both cases, they speak very highly of the revolutionary potential of the Spear Societies. And in the second case, the only thing CCP tried to criticize was that many of the Spear Societies were led by the local landowner, landlords, right? So if we want to drive a pattern revolution, we need to sort of disclose the wrongdoing of the leading classes and try to separate them from the rest of the ordinary rural peasants. But overall, CCP saw them as a very promising revolutionary force in the 1920s. But with a lot of changes in rural China, and also Elizabeth Perry claimed that the CCP's absorption of the rural military forces was overall a failure because they have totally different views. To the Spear Societies, their only purpose was to survive, right? Because of social turmoil and warfare, and they need to defend themselves from bandits. They practice a lot of rituals to protect themselves, but they have no intention of adopting any specific ideologies or change the power structure in rural China completely. Whereas the CCP had a totally different view. Right? You not only need to absorb these people, but also you need to teach them a new teaching, new ideology. That's something the Spear Society has no interest in at all. So as we're getting closer to 1949, we'll see the pleasant coexistence, came to an end, and the CCP really wanted to cut off the foundation of all this Spear Society. So during the Civil War period and also the early PRC, if you take a look at all the local gadgeteers in China, you'll find a lot of so-called rare disturbances against the CCP or PLA around the year of 1949, and most of them was related to famine or the PLA's green levy policy, because in the Civil War period, the PLA was expanding ambitiously, right? You need food, you need a lot of military provision, and in this context, the local Spear Society saw the PLA just like bandits, right? Because you are robbing me of my food, but my very limited resources, so they defended the local community against the PLA. That's where the story started. And so the Spear Society was labeled by the CCP as bandits in 1949, and later part of counter-revolutionary huidaomen group. So I had a very small case study in the last section of my paper. So I just wanted to show you that in the case of Guiyang County in Jiangxi province, there were floods, natural disasters, and the famine and family activity, and finally the PLA arrived at the same time when the famine was very spread. So this is the Guiyang Lake area, the biggest freshwater lake in China. So Jiangxi province was seen as a major military provision source for the Jiaozhai for southern China. And the military provision and the green levy policy was very relentless in the case of Jiangxi province. I show you some data. It's actually from CCP's official sources. From 6 villages in Guiyang, new government levy actually almost like 90% of each household for the grain storage. And in the case of neighboring Guangdian County, it's even higher with 30%. And think about people already impacted in natural disaster. That's something unbearable. So there was large scale resistance from the Spear Society, like in the case of Guiyang, the local Spear Society called the Yellow Crane Society rebel, the Big Spear Society rebel against the new government. But finally, because the new government have the modern weapons, they were able to crash all this rebellions or the so-called rebellions. And in the case of the Jiangxi province, the city also launched 3 anti-panic campaigns in the year of 1949. And after the 3 campaigns, almost all the Spear Society disappeared in the case of mainland China. And the similar story also happened to other parts of China as well. So in my paper, I also used Guangdi's case study of Sichuan province. You can see exactly the same pattern that was also happening in Sichuan. So I'll just stop here, and the conclusion part for my paper, I also mentioned, in the 1980s, when all kinds of traditional Chinese martial art came back when China reopened to the outside, the invulnerability ratio definitely didn't get back, right? And because it doesn't really fit the kind of commercialized martial arts practices in the 1980s and 90s, so it's closely related to people's existential threats, bandits, warfare. But when there was a relatively peaceful environment, there's no space for the Spear Society, only would be really, its existence. All right, I'll just stop here. Thank you.
We have so much. It is my honor to be the last presenter today, and I'll try my best to finish within 15 minutes. Okay, now let's go. I study how superstition has been reimagined in internet-based fantasy novels to demonstrate that in contemporary China, in 24th century China, a new life of what was labeled superstition is to serve as a raw material for profit making in the entertainment industry and a training material for fantasy writers and readers who process information to produce values. So basically, the subject matter of my research will introduce to you a new player in this game of manufacturing, regulating superstition. Because so far we have been paid attention to the Chinese state and local society and the family structure. And now, okay, we have digital capital. At the outset, I emphasize that I pay attention to first, superstition as a negative label used by the state and cultural elites in modern Chinese history. And second, I study ideas and practices once labeled superstitious in modernizing projects with quotation marks, superstition. And then third, I study the same set of ideas and practices disembedded from their original contexts and reconfigured in and for creative industries in the 21st century. And for the third part, I use the term magic or magical, and I borrow the term from the title of this panel. And to supplement existing scholarship on the revival of the so-called superstitious practices, I turn to popular culture and zoom in on internet-based fantasy. Among fantasy writers, I chose to focus on Xu Shengzhi, who, in addition to his novels, is renowned for his experience of practicing Mei Dan internal alchemy and working as a licensed financial analyst. Born in 1974, Xu Shengzhi grew up witnessing two fevers sweeping across China, or post-socialist China, the Guoxue fever and the Qigong fever. He was an avid reader of ancient classics and was reputed to be a practitioner of Qigong. After college, he tried various jobs and eventually settled down as a financial analyst around 1998, writing daily recommendations for investors in China's newly minted stock market. A columnist writing for Hexun.com, a financial portal. In 2004, Xu Shengzhi started to entertain himself and his readers by telling ghost stories related to financial transactions, which were collected into his first book, 股市智异, Strange Tales from Stock Affairs, later retitled 鬼谷, Ghosts and Stocks. Motivated by the popularity of these stories, Xu Shengzhi opened an account on Qidian, now world's largest literary platform specializing in popular fiction. And he started to serialize his first novel, Shen You, Spirit Growing, in 2006. And he serialized this novel for 2 years. So the novel was finished in 2008. Shen You is a Xiuzhen novel, immortality cultivation novel. And just now, Yupeng just mentioned immortality cultivation as a Taoist practice. And Xiuzhen in today's internet literature is a subgenre, a fantasy subgenre centered upon the protagonist's alchemical training experiences aimed at achieving immortality by cultivating the qi within his or her body. And Xu claimed that this novel, Spirit Roaming, was written as a Dan Shu alchemy manual in the style of Xi You Ji. Okay, you heard about Xi You Ji the second time today. And in Xi You Ji, the author actually hides alchemy formulas within adventure stories. And the success of Shen You, which was written in the style of Xi You Ji, launched Xu Shengzhi's career as a fantasy writer. who has serialized altogether 10 novels till today. It is to be noted that he continued to work as a stock analyst until 2010, when he finally decided to become a full-time writer. Okay, let's meet the author. Acutely aware of the negative connotations of the term superstition, Xu Shengzhi never used it in his media interviews and even critiqued this modernist discourse in the voices of his fictional characters. In his novels, what was negatively labeled superstition is presented as an alternative knowledge system coexisting with science and an embodiment of traditional values in Chinese society. However, the major concern of these novels is not to legitimize the actual practice of superstition, but to remold this type of information for fantasy world building. As a financial professional, Xu Shengzhi gathered and analyzed data from various industries to produce reports on companies and stocks, predicting their future performances and making recommendations on when to buy, sell, or hold certain stocks. Similarly, he collected information regarding specific superstitious practices by reading available print publications, searching online materials, and having conversations with his readers or his fans. What he practiced is immaterial labor that produces the informational, cultural, and affective content of a commodity. His novel within a transmedial context. So let's skip. Okay. Internet literature is undeniably a field of immaterial labor or transmedia work. In this environment, superstition, okay, with quotation marks, superstition is not just tolerated, but eagerly sought because it is potentially profitable. It provides a vast amount of information needed by transmedia world building. Xu Shengzhi, his readers, and the production teams responsible for expanding his novels into other media are all cognitive and affective workers, adjusting themselves to a transmedia environment to produce immaterial knowledges and experiences. They have been training themselves in this process. I studied Xu's style of writing, as well as the world-building endeavors of the author, his readers, and the entertainment industry. And Xu Shengzhi integrated quasi-scholarly exposition of specific techniques into his storytelling, presenting ideas and practices under the rubric of non-rational superstition as a highly rational and sophisticated knowledge system. For instance, in his novels, he introduced 内丹 and feng shui rationales and techniques in parentheses within the narrative, or within footnotes in the author's words section. And he also provided links to full research articles on other platforms. Xu's novels are all interconnected, working collectively to build a unified cosmos. This cosmos has its own social political order. The author claims that, quote, the weight of all activities in the human realm is called jianghu, rivers and lakes. The scales of all practical matters in jianghu are arranged into the 八门, 8 gates, and here men as in huidaomen. The imaginary 八门 is a system of practical techniques. For instance, feng shui masters take 托普 as their grandmaster and form the gate of wind. It's their professional association. It's like a guild-like association. And internal and external alchemists gather in the name of Hong to form the gate of fire. And in sum, altogether, there are like 8 gates. And the imaginary 8 gates, 八门, is a result of the author's re-systemization of magical practices and organizations. That is, superstitions reimagined, disconnected from their original context, and rearranged for transmedia world-building projects. On November 20th, 2017, Xu Shengzhi started to serialize 方外, the beyond at 网易文学, NetEase Literature, the literary platform run by NetEase, 网易, one of China's largest internet companies. It is interesting to point out that the subtitle, as you can see on the slide, of the novel 方外 is 消失的八门, the lost 8 gates. The 8 gates were mentioned here and there in earlier novels, but for the first time presented comprehensively in 方外. And NetEase, 网易, wrote Xu Shengzhi a big fat check. We don't know exactly what that amount was because it's kind of business secret. But what we know is that NetEase purchased from the author Feng Wai, especially the idea of Bamen as an intellectual property. NetEase was the only platform where Feng Wai, the novel, was serialized. And NetEase also owned the adaptation rights of the novel into manga, film, and TV series and video games. In early December, NetEase hosted a book launch ceremony in Zhangjiajie, Hunan. And as we can see in the photo there, Xu Shengzhi's fans were invited to the ceremony, which for them was a special 兰香会, meeting of orchid fragrance. They had their annual meetings with the author and named this meeting 兰香会, where they exchanged gifts with the author and discussed traditional cultural wisdom, not excluding the superstitious elements of Chinese traditional culture. At the book launch ceremony, also the 2017 author-reader gathering, a mini theme park was installed by NetEase, which will, so this theme park was divided into 8 sections, or 八门, where guests solved puzzles to move around and have fun. At this Disneyland-like park is where the 2 sides of transmedia world building met, fan activities and industrial projects. Xu Shengzhi's fans, just like the author, are transmedia workers using their cognitive and affective capacities to process information, or superstitious information. And they gathered outside the literary platforms where the novels were serialized to meet online and offline and provide a network indispensable for the author's literary creation. One of Xu Shengzhi's leaders I interviewed is a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine. She was a member of one QQ group Xu Shengzhi frequented during the serialization of Shen You. And she was quite happy to see a tree spirit in that novel, named after her ID in that group. She was also active in many other similar groups, the themes of which were 八字, 8 characters, 面相, physiognomy, and of course traditional Chinese medicine. According to her, when Xu Shengzhi posted a question in his group, it would be answered by fans who drew on their personal experiences, performed on-spot research, or transferred the question to other groups to get help. They worked as a crowd intelligence that Xu relied on. Moreover, there are networks of the so-called superstitious practitioners and enthusiasts online with these, with which Xu Shengzhi's fan circles overlap. So there is an overlap of the fan circles and the networks of superstitious practitioners. And these, so the fans of Xu Shengzhi's exchange not just knowledge, but also experiences and emotions. Another interviewee of mine is a researcher on internet literature. He participated in one of the 兰香会, and he reported that Xu Shengzhi was a charismatic figure to whom his fans brought their personal stories and wanted spiritual guidance in return. A highly emotional bond tied these people into a small community that extended from online to the offline space. It is these pre-existing networks of labor that media corporations try to exploit. Transmediation is not just the practices of fans, but also a business strategy adopted by media capital to capture social identities and relations. Back in 2010, when Shen You Spirit Roaming was published offline, as a 7-volume book series by 中国华侨出版社. A couplet was printed on the book cover, and we can read it here. 陈天桥惊为天人，手不释卷。徐公子天才绝伦，料理生化. So the English translation goes like, 陈天桥 was amazed and could not put down these books. Xu Gongzi was talented and brought forth flowers under his pen. And who is Chen Tianqiao? Who is this guy? Chen Tianqiao founded Shengda, an entertainment company in 1999, which acquired Qidian in 2004 and established Shengda Wenxue, Shengda Literature in 2008. Simply put, Chen Tianqiao was the boss of the media corporation that owned the literary platform where Xu Shengzhi serialized his novels. So he's the big boss behind. Chen Tianqiao was Xu's reader and a fan, and Chen Tianqiao claimed that Xu Shengzhi was his most favorite author at Qidian, comparing his novels with the Harry Potter series. For Chen Tianqiao, Harry Potter was not just a series of novels, but a transmedia universe, a magical model for his own business empire, which brought together internet literature, video games, and film and TV productions. However, in 2015, Shengda Literature, with Qidian included, was acquired by Tencent, another technology and entertainment conglomerate. Shengda Literature changed into Yuewen Group under Tencent, Tengxun. Chen Tianqiao was forced into early retirement and moved to California here. He's here. Tencent shares with Shengda its transmedia dream and is developing into the Chinese Disney. Tencent is without its competitors. And Xu Shengzhi was selected by NetEase, Wangyi, the third company interested in playing the transmedia game. However, only 2 years later, NetEase retreated back off from this game, and NetEase sold its literature and manga department to Pingzhi Information, Pingzhi Xinxi. And Pingzhi Xinxi is a company based in Hangzhou, Zhejiang, and now guess who the owner is? The Department of Finance of Zhejiang Province, the Chinese state. So the transmedia project of Fangwai was finally aborted. I venture to argue that the biggest player in the transmedia game is not Tengxun, but the Chinese state. And I may want to add the subtitle, the encounter of media capital and the CCP, just to build a connection between my presentation and the other presentations. And here I venture to argue that the biggest player in the transmedia game is the Chinese state. Before 2010, internet literature was a wild space beyond state censorship. However, the state started to exert its power in the 2010s in a series of internet purifying campaigns to delete novels with pornographic and illegal contents, 扫黄打非, and 封建迷信 is again targeted. Fantasy writers found it increasingly hard to upload their chapters featuring superstitions to literary platforms. Some even abandoned their still being serialized novels. Although the transmedia project of adapting Xu's novels is yet to materialize due to the fierce competition between all these different corporations, the existing adaptation of fantasy novels by many other authors is characterized by the sanitization of superstition by giving scientific explanation for the existence of ghosts and spirits, by celebrating traditional values, or hiding the illegitimate under the veneer of fictional imagination. As long as it is imaginary, it's okay. It's not 反动会道, it's imaginary 八门. So it is because these cultural productions are still tightly controlled by the state, which may refuse to grant a registered number to a book, a film, or a game, or the state is able to pull them off the market even when the products are already in circulation. And the new life of the so-called superstition does not guarantee its release from past histories, as the other presenters have already explored for us. And this is the end of my presentation.